So you personally, have you given it any thought as to which option you've taken? Because you are a leading member of the government. You're a leading member.
Oh, indeed. But unlike some of my other colleagues, I prefer to have my conversations in cabinet rather than in the media.
So you're keeping no deal on the table?
As I say, I will make my views known if the deal does not go through, and I think that I still will campaign over the next few days to ensure that that deal does go through.
Chris Leslie and then Matt Western.
So just to be clear, you agree with the Prime Minister having put, for this time next week, a vote on no deal as an option? She was right to do that.
If I didn't agree with the Prime Minister, I wouldn't be in the Cabinet.
So if that's the case, what you're saying is that there will be collective decision of government on whether to vote for no deal. That's from the consequence of your answer previously.
I imagine that there will be a collective decision.
Right. And does that mean that you could potentially be voting for no deal this time next week?
Well,
Potentially
all things are possible.
So yes, is the answer to that question.
Potentially all things are possible is the answer to that question.
So we've got before us a Secretary of State for Trade who potentially, in 7 days' time, could be voting for a no-deal Brexit.
No, you have a Secretary of State who wants the House to vote for a deal,
yeah,
including all members of this committee, because he believes that that's the best way to avoid unnecessary friction in our economy.
Did you see the comments from the lead civil servant, the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, David Sterling, in the Financial Times this morning, who warns, quote, "The consequence of material business failure as a result of a no-deal exit, combined with changes to everyday life and potential border frictions, could well have a profound and long-lasting impact on society." And then he went on to say that there were very limited actions that could be taken to mitigate that. Doesn't that give you pause not this time next week to vote for no deal?
That is why I will vote for a deal. Precisely why I will vote for a deal.
So
all those who want to avoid the consequences of no deal,
yeah,
and yet will vote against the deal, will be bringing those consequences about.
I understand that you want the deal on Tuesday. We're all clear about that. You're going to vote for the deal next Tuesday. But it's possible that next Wednesday, in only 7 days' time, you and the rest of the government will be voting for a no-deal Brexit. Just want to be absolutely crystal clear. This is the cold facts of the matter are that is where you could be.
We will want to avoid that, and I'm not going to be drawn on what might or might not happen when the government's policy is not fulfilled. The government will work for that policy. We believe that the agreement that is set out is the best way for us to leave the European Union, to fulfil the wish of the electorate at the referendum, but to do so in the most orderly way possible.
But you think it could be a responsible thing to do the subsequent day on the Wednesday to vote for no deal? It could be, it's a choice you're leaving open. It's not irresponsible to do that.
I think the responsible thing is to vote for a deal.
Just to follow up.
And congratulations, Mr. Leslie, for being the first independent to get a seat on this committee.
Thank you. It may be my last day.
This committee is a broad
I'm sure it won't be.
Secretary of State, just to follow up on that, you described no deal as survivable, I think was the word you used, survivable. Industry, major leaders, corporate leaders are saying that no deal would be catastrophic and would be existential, i.e. that it would be seriously damaging to them. And I'm talking about major names that you'll be very, very familiar with. Are they wrong?
To me, existential means that it threatens your existence. If the argument is that not getting a deal with the European Union would threaten the existence of the UK economy, I think that's hyperbole. I think that there are issues. If we look at what, for example, the Governor of the Bank of England was saying about how no-deal preparations had been accelerated and were much better than they were before, I think that takes you well out of existential. Would it be a problem? And would it be a specific problem for some industries? Yes, it could be. And that's why I go back to my point, which I know it's boring, but that's why I think that we should vote for a deal. That's why I think all MPs should vote for a deal, which is why I think MPs who say, with all due respect, these are terrible consequences of no deal, but consistently vote against a deal, need to understand what they may be ushering in.
But the point, just to be very clear, the companies like Ford are talking about their businesses. They're not talking about the UK economy, because, of course, that will survive in some form there'll be some residual economy, for sure. But they're talking about their existence as a business. And they're saying it will be catastrophic for them. That's the point.
Well, can I just say I completely take exception to that view that leaving the European Union without an agreement with the European Union would leave us with a residual economy of some form. This is an economy with record employment, with half the rate of unemployment as the Eurozone. This is a country that had a 20% increase in foreign direct investment last year when continental Europe went down 73%. This is a country where we are seeing our strongest export performance of all time. The idea that not leaving it with a deal, which I accept, is hugely suboptimal compared to getting a deal, but it would leave us with a residual economy of some kind, does not help to encourage rational debate about this issue.
So the damage to the UK car manufacturing sector you're not concerned about?
I made it very clear that I think it would be damaging to the UK economy, and I think it is better to get a deal. I don't know how often I have to say this, but I think a deal is better than a no deal. I mean, it's a relatively simple concept.
The deal, of course, keeps the UK and the European Union for 21 months, and we hear the phrase, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And I knew the type of Brexiteer that wants Brexit, but you certainly don't want it this month.
No, I want us to honour the result of the referendum, which I
Union
believe was no. To stay in the European Union would not be honouring the referendum. We have to leave. Chairman, if I may finish,
yes.
We have to leave the European Union because we have been instructed to by the voters of the United Kingdom, the voters that we as Parliament gave the right to make that decision. Now, if we're doing that, in my view, you have to do that in the best way possible. We can have arguments about what the best way is. Some would argue it's best to have a deal. Some would argue that it's best to have a no deal. But I doubt if anyone argues that it is democratically defensible to ignore an elected plebiscite. If you can ignore one, Mr. Chairman, you can ignore another, which I think might have implications for your party.
Can you remind us how much the Treasury said a no-deal Brexit would damage the economy by, if that happens on the 29th of March? Because this might be helpful to your argument.
I've argued that we should have a deal, and I do have a deal because I want us to have the implementation period and the time to adjust our economy for what we can.
Do you know the number the Treasury said that the no-deal Brexit would hurt the economy?
There are a whole range, and they're
8%.
They're not predictions. They are not predictions. They are scenario planning, which I've explained to this committee before is not the same thing.
And your deal
they're not predictions,
your deal
Chairman.
then commits the UK to be leaving the custody in the single market 21 months later, which will damage the economy by 6%. You're clear on that with people too?
Again, these are not predictions, these are scenario plannings, that if nothing else changes in that period, if there is no agreement, if there is no mitigation.
So, on the 6th of January, you said, I think no deal would damage your economy. I've been frank about that. You're not as frank about it this morning. Why not?
I have said that I think a no deal...
Well, why not the numbers?
Go back and look at the transcript of what I've just said. I think a no deal would inflict damage on our economy unnecessarily. That is why I think we ought to have a deal.
Have you any numbers for the damage? Or is the damage just off the top of your head? What is the underpinning of your phrase, damage?
I think it would create problems in our economy, not least for our exporters.
You have no numbers.
And it would depend on what mitigations were in place. It would also depend what the future economic agreement was with the European Union itself. There are a whole range of issues. As the Treasury
we're looking for numbers, not bluster. Secretary of State, we're looking for numbers, not bluster.
No, I'm sorry, but the point is that the number cannot be. You cannot pick a number without looking at a whole range of mitigations.
Ronald J. Warner.
Thank you, Chairman. We're very clear you want a deal, and indeed many of us may want a deal also, but it's also a matter of fact that not a single member of this committee voted for the deal that was put forward, and signs are that the deal isn't being changed. So last week the government said that in February departments reported being on track for just under 85% of no-deal projects. It's clearly very important that the government completes that work. What percentage of no-deal projects in your department are on track?
In terms of the range of issues that we look at, business readiness, trade agreements, trade remedies, GPA, a large proportion, I'm not sure I could put I'm not sure I could put a figure on that, given that a number of them are very complex. But I think that DIT is well advanced in that. Of course, what we hope is that a lot of that preparation was unnecessary for the no-deal scenario itself. Again, on a lot of those issues, it's far better for us, for example, on trade continuity, that we get that agreement with the European Union.
You've been very clear about that, but let's probe into what happens in the event of a no deal. So on Sunday, you said in your interview on the BBC that 52% of our trade is outside the EU, 11% of the 52% comes from the EU's FTAs, of which 5.5% is dependent on the agreement itself. So you were also very coy about the progress that had been made in respect of the most important, if I can put it that way, that bluntly, the most important agreements that this government is seeking to roll over. Can you assure us, though, that those top 7 will be ready to be rolled over?
Well, Switzerland, of course, which is by far the largest, has already been
the top 7
rolled over. Of those, the next agreements would be Canada, EEA, South Korea, South African grouping plus Mozambique. They are all making good progress.
So they will be ready?
Well, the question, of course, is dependent on those who are on the other side. We're ready. Mm-hmm. A number of countries are still looking to say, should we set out our potential negotiating hand for future FTAs on the chance that there will be an agreement and we don't need to plan for no deal. So, as I said at the committee last time, a number of those agreements, although they're very advanced in terms of negotiation, may come in very late in the day.
But so to be clear, though, you're pretty confident. I think it would be fair to say that the British government's ready, and so it's simply relying on the third party, the third country, to agree it. But in the event that they don't, the figures you state say that actually it's a very small proportion of our trade that's actually covered by these agreements that need to be rolled over anyway.
If I can just make a correction to the number that I used on Andrew Marr, which was 5.4, it's actually it's closer to 3.5.
So it's even smaller.
Of the proportion that for that trade would be done under zero tariffs. So that trade would occur anyway, whether or not those agreements were made. So of the agreements that we have so far, of the 11%, Switzerland is 22%. The other agreements we already have will take us to between 25%, where the other, as I explained the last time, the top agreements are themselves worth about 75%. So we could get 30 agreements and cover 25% of our trade, or we could get 5 or 6 and cover 75%. That clearly is the priority for the department.
Exactly.
And those bigger ones are at a good stage of advancement. Perhaps if I, as I say, don't take my word for it, ask John.
Yeah, well, they're all in very intensive discussions. As the Secretary of State says, it depends on taking two to tango and the attitude of those countries and bringing them in as and when they see that as essential.
And my final question, Chairman, the 48% of our trade that is with the EU, what work have you been doing, what consideration have you been giving to using Article 24 of GATT as an alternative transitional arrangement on our way to negotiating a free trade agreement? Because, of course, they've said, in respect to the backstop, that actually the ambition is to negotiate a free trade agreement anyway. So if the intention is there to take that in good faith, then actually it will also be true that Article 24 could be applied.
Of course, both sides would have to agree, which I presume would require unanimity of the EU 27.
No, it only requires the Commission, because it's the prerogative of the Commission to negotiate.
Indeed, but I would have thought, given the circumstances of a no deal, it would be prudent of the Commission to take cognizance of the democratic wishes of the elected governments of Europe. But I accept that's another argument entirely. But my understanding is if we were to use Article 24, it would require the agreement of the other side and also at least a framework FTA to be in place, neither of which could be guaranteed.
But what work have you done? What consideration have you given? That was the question.
Well, of course, the relationship with Europe is not my department's responsibility. That is the DEXU.
But what consideration have you given, though?
We have looked at it, but the conclusion we've come to is that could not be depended upon as a route because of the two considerations I mentioned.
Just alluded there to Europe not being a very centralised place, but referring to its member states, which runs across counter to a lot of the Brexiteer narrative. I thought the EU would be, the Commission would be telling us all what was happening.
Mr. Chairman, one of the reasons I voted to leave was the lack of consultation between the Commission and its member states. The exact debate that I was alluding to.
You've just alluded to it there, Matt Western.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, I think you would agree you're actually off the pace in terms of where you wanted to be or were expected to be at this stage with the negotiation of the existing free trade agreements with the EU. But just in terms of this ongoing continued uncertainty that we face, how is that impacting on your ability to properly engage with the priority new FTA partners you're seeking, i.e. the US, Australia, New Zealand and so on?
Oh, well, it doesn't, because we can't begin the negotiations until after we have left the EU.
Well, you're having conversations.
We can have limited conversations about potential scoping, but that's as far as we can go. Under our duty of sincere cooperation, that's as far as we can go.
Sincere cooperation.
So the conversations you've been having, say, with the US have been very, very limited?
They have been very, very broad, because we are not allowed to enter into what could be regarded as negotiations. It's very clear.
I understand not negotiations, but you can have sort of setting parameters or outline consideration of where you might want to consider. The US has made it absolutely clear where they want to be.
And we will, when we are able to be in a position where we can legally set out what we want in terms of future frameworks.
Okay. Just to move on, the Financial Times reported last week that if there is a no-deal Brexit, the government will set tariffs for most industrial products at zero. In that case, why would any country want to grant us concessions in a free trade agreement?
Well, I certainly wouldn't comment on any potential leak, well-informed or otherwise. The government will set out what it believes to be the correct tariffs if, in fact, we get to a no-deal scenario.
A number of people have run in at this stage. Whoa, freeze. Hold on. Julia first.
I just wanted to ask a quick supplementary to Ranulph's question, which was about, you suggested it would be DEXU that would need to deal with any Article 24 process. You referred to the idea that we would need to put forward a framework for a future free trade agreement. Is that not something that would come within your department's remit? And if so, have you drawn up a future framework for a future FTA that you could simply put on the table on the day after a no-deal exit?
The relationship with Europe, of course, is not a simple FTA because it involves a whole other range of areas, including security, which is why it's dealt with as a separate issue and why DEXU has always taken the lead from the time of the setting up of DEXU and DIT.
So what conversations has your department had with those other departments on the trade elements of a future framework?
John?
Well, as the Secretary of State said, we are responsible for the trade agreements with the rest of the world. DEXU are responsible for the trade agreement and other agreements with the EU. Obviously, we talk to them because what you do in one area has implications for other areas. But the government hasn't begun either the negotiations with the rest of the world or the future partnership negotiations with the EU. So those are simply discussions internally at this stage.
If I may, it's a very pertinent question for what I think the follow-up question would be, which is that the government will need to create an architecture for the next phase so that there is very close coordination between what is discussed in terms of the trading arrangement with Europe, because that will inform and affect the potential trading relationships outside the European Union.
So that those conversations
and those conversations are taking place about how that architecture would be constructed.
And when did they begin?
There have been discussions for some time, but serious discussions about the architecture are underway at present.
How confident are you at how rapidly that kind of conversation could be drawn together so that after the day after we leave the EU without a deal, we have a strategy that is coherent, in place, and ready to go, to be tabled if necessary? I
would say we're making good progress on that, but John might want to comment as he's involved in some of the detail.
Sorry, the only thing I was going to add was that obviously when the white paper the Chequers White Paper was published, that reflected a lot of cross-departmental work precisely to set out the position vis-à-vis the EU, taking account of our wider trade policy interests.
Thank you. We're back to my question. We then need cooperation from members because a number of you want to come in with short, sharp questions. So courtesy to others if you keep them short and sharp. Thank you.
I just want to come back to the point that I was making about the US and its outlining the sort of requirements that it expects from some future trade agreement with the UK. That included comprehensive market access for US agricultural goods and removing unwanted barriers, i.e. related to sanitary and phytosanitary standards, that block the export of US food and agricultural products. Had a lot of coverage in the media over the last few days, which you'll be well aware of. How do you respond to that?
I respond to the fact that these are the same negotiating objectives that they set out for their relationship with the future trade relationship with the European Union and Japan, with the exception that for the UK it doesn't deal with IP and it doesn't deal with trade surplus, which the US feels is not an issue with the UK. So it's exactly what we would have expected.
But as far as you're concerned, clearly from the US, agriculture is a major bargaining chip for them. That's what they want access to is markets in the UK, and that will be their priority. And you're okay with that?
It's what we expect in a negotiation. It's exactly the same negotiating objectives, bar the two that I mentioned, as the US set out in terms of its negotiations with Japan and the EU. It is exactly what we expected to see.
Even at a damage our agri-food sector, which
it's exactly what we expected.
Very concerned about.
It's exactly what we expected to see because it's exactly what the US has done in other trade negotiations.
You're quite relaxed about agriculture. You're relaxed about the NHS.
I said I didn't make any assessment of what our position would be. I said that's exactly what we would have expected the United States to do.
Do you expect the NHS to be there then?
No, we expect the same issues to come up as have come up in these other negotiations. We will maintain the same position as we took when we were involved, for example, in the EU negotiations with the US, which is the governments must have a right, reserved right, to determine the regulation of their own public services. That's been a consistent position of the UK.
Secretary of State, the American ambassador on the Today programme this morning made it absolutely clear that he would expect in any trade deal to float all the boats, and that clearly includes agriculture. So, he said that this morning. So what is your response to him? And you can understand where he's coming from, surely.
I would find it very odd if an American ambassador to the United Kingdom was not reflecting the entire line of the American government in terms of the negotiating objectives. It is a negotiation.
Do you rather perversely think, though, that if we left without a deal with the European Union, that it would be more advantageous for you in any negotiation with the United States of America to do a trade deal with them?
Well, we have not yet set out our approach to what we would want to do. There are a lot of phases in that. And we will set out what the UK's objectives are in due course. I'm not sure that actually it makes much difference.
Thank you. Faisal Rashid. One question, then Marcus Fish.
In relation to future trade agreements, in particular with the United States, many of my constituents have been in touch expressing concerns about the NHS position in future trade deals. In particular, they are worried, for example, the large US private healthcare companies could take over parts of NHS and be given new powers to sue the government to demand more NHS contracts. One of the key objectives of American trade negotiators in any future trade deals and post-Brexit is to secure access for American companies to business in the NHS. So can you guarantee that the NHS will be excluded from these future trade deals?
I have said, almost literally till I'm blue in the face, that we will follow the pattern that we have set before, which is that we will insist on reservations, such as we had in the Canadian Treaty, CETA, that public services regulation will be exempt from the provisions of the treaty.
Would you prevent NHS being a bargaining chip?
I've just said that. Frankly, I don't know how to make it any clearer.
Yes, you're saying yes.
I don't know how to make it any clearer. We will ensure that the regulation of public services becomes the duty of a sovereign government.
That's yes.
Thank you, Chairman.
Marcus Fisher.
Just a brief set of questions, quick ones. Does it matter what our tariff schedule is? Does it matter what our tariffs are set at?
In a no-deal, is this in a no-deal scenario?
Yeah, in any scenario.
Yes, it does matter.
Yeah. So when will we be publishing the schedule of tariffs that we would apply should we leave without a withdrawal agreement?
That will be a decision primarily taken. It's, of course, a Treasury responsibility when the SIs are laid.
So is it possible that Parliament will be asked to vote next week on not having a withdrawal agreement without knowing what the conditions of the tariff schedule intention of the government would be?
I think it would be beneficial for us to have that information in front of us, but I'm unable to make a decision on behalf of the government, as that does not fall within my departmental responsibility.
Yeah. Do you think that the car industry is interested in what its tariff conditions would be in a no-deal scenario?
Well, I think that any manufacturing industry that was dependent on intermediate goods would want to know what potential input costs would be, and they will also want to know what potential no-deal implications would be for their potential external-facing tariffs, which might affect their exports.
Do you think that they know more or less about their tariff position and what that would be than what they would know about whether their just-in-time supply chains will function and what the costs of customs administration would be in a no-deal scenario?
Well, I'm not responsible for some of those elements, but clearly in terms of input costs, it would matter to a number of businesses, including the car industry, what that would be. There would be a number of other factors, which potentially could act as mitigants. But
so has the government been communicating the possibility of using the transit system to make sure that clearance doesn't have to occur at the borders themselves to the car industry? Because they are concerned about those borders being shut.
That's an HMRC issue, but clearly there are a range of those issues that businesses will take into account and would have to have in account if it came to a no-deal scenario.
Chris Leslie.
Yeah, I'm just getting the sense we're being stonewalled here, Secretary of State, and almost every answer we've got is, wait and see, not sure yet, vote for the deal on Tuesday, can't tell you anything that's happening after. I mean, there's 560-something hours left to go. I don't know whether you realise it, but sort of holding a gun to the head of MPs like this is not exactly a way to persuade us to trust in your particular strategy. So on this question, for instance, of unilateral tariff reduction or setting what those tariffs are going to be, you really need to start telling business now what will happen in that scenario. For example, the Freight Transport Association have expressed their concerns today about what are the tariffs on goods that will be en route at that moment, 11 p.m, March the 29th. Okay, and we're in a position where those logistics are almost now within sight. You're going to have goods and services moving across. Can you at least give an assurance to those drivers, those businesses that will be in transit, what the tariffs are going to be at that particular moment in time?
Well, it's again, while the general decisions have been taken on that, the decision on timing of publication has not yet been reached. Again, that will be a collective decision. If I may go further than the question, my personal preference would be that we would know that information before we took a decision on a no-deal outcome. But Mr. Leslie will understand that I'm not in a position to be able to guarantee that that will happen, other than having my voice heard on the debate.
I just think we're being given the runaround here, and it makes me want to halt this whole process and go to a position where we can do this in a way that is safe for those who are potentially now going to be booking and ordering goods. What if goods are driving from Asia through Europe, coming through the Dover Straits, you just can't give us any even basic data about what those tariff rates are going to be at that particular time.
Well, the decision to publish will be one of timing.
Thank you, Sir Mark Henry.
Chair, if I could move on to the Department's expenditure. Your Department's 2018-19 supplementary estimate shows an increase in its capital budget of over 450% compared to the original estimate, and nearly all of this is for, quote, digital data and technology. Secretary of State, can you tell us what IT systems and software are you investing this money in?
Well, of course, a great amount of what we've been doing is to upgrade our current systems to be able to deal with the changes potentially of leaving the European Union. So a lot of that's been EU-orientated activity. What we've been doing through great.gov.uk, for example, and the related programmes that come from that. Perhaps Catherine would be the one to give you the level of detail that you need.
So all of the department's EU exit funding was allocated through the supplementary estimates process. So all of that attributed to the investment we needed to make came at that stage in the government's financial allocations. Some of that investment is going on the simple IT kit that our growing staff numbers need. So whether it's laptops or phones, we need to make sure that the new Trade Remedies Authority has got the right IT infrastructure to operate. That includes things like Wi-Fi in buildings. And then there are a range of EU exit related services that we need to make sure could operate on day one. So that will include things like...
Are these the ports?
So the Tariff application platform is one of those pieces of digital infrastructure that needs to work alongside HMRC systems to make sure that any tariffs could be properly levied. So yes, part of our expenditure does relate to that.
But from the recent report we had, we found that obviously the huge increase in volume on the day after Brexit cannot be handled by the current IT systems. Is that part of what this expenditure is for? So
the responsibilities for handling how goods and tariffs are raised at the border is HMRC's responsibility. We have a responsibility to make sure that we provide the relevant tariff information into their systems. The NAO recently published a report on border readiness, and on this particular systems, the current assessment of readiness is an amber green for the tariff application platform, which DIT has got IT responsibility for, and an amber on the processes. So there is absolutely more work to be done, but DIT has done a great deal to make sure it is prepared for that scenario.
And are you confident all this will be on place the day after Brexit?
So there are significant interdependencies between what DIT needs to do and HMRC systems. But those systems are currently being tested, and there are obviously still conversations being had about when those tariffs might be published, and that will affect the sort of ability to test those in advance. But preparations are in good shape from a DIT perspective.
I mean, the NAO report also talks about shortages in terms of manpower as well, not just the technology. Are you looking at those issues as well?
So those responsibilities don't fall to DIT.
But you're providing the tariffs, presumably. You've got to have people there that can ensure that this information is in there with the HMRC systems.
So in terms of our ability to populate the data on tariffs, yes, we have people we have sufficient capacity to make sure that those tariffs are uploaded correctly.
Okay.
Could I just add the initial part of Sir Mark's question, ask about the size of the increase of the budget in relation to our total budget.
Yes.
There are two things I would say about that. The first is that this is still a growing department, and there is considerable IT cost per employee that's unavoidable when that happens. And the second is, of course, is that we are, as a department, in somewhat of a unique position in that we were created in the middle of a Treasury spending round. And so the budget that we began with was, if you like, an estimate of a budget that a new department would require. So I think the fact that there are big revisions to that is not unsurprising.
Well, on that point, the day-to-day budget of the department is growing by about 10% per year since it was created, and is due to increase by 13% next year. Are you saying that you expect this spending growth to continue?
Well, we will, of course, as we go into the spending round like other departments, we'll want to look at what we project our future functions to be and what we think the necessary manpower will be. One of the areas that we will want to look at is not this particular area, but our overseas network and how we think that can be best placed and what the appropriate size is and what the interaction with FCO and DFID would be for us to be able to maximise the generation of income abroad for the UK.
And last week, the press reported that your department had spent more than £100,000 on a podcast that had only been downloaded 8,000 times, costing the taxpayer around £12.70 per listen. What lessons can you learn from this, and do you feel that it was worth it?
What I can say is that we have identified about 400,000 businesses in the UK that say they could be exporting but are not exporting. So we need to try and get the appropriate messages to them to get them into exporting, because that generates income for the UK. We use a range of media on that, on print media, social media, through to podcasts. It's impossible to know at the beginning of any of those what effect they will have, but at the end of each of them they are subjected to a review to ensure that we get value for money and lessons are constantly learned.
So your intentions are good, but do you feel that that was an effective use of money?
Well, it depends on how many of the businesses who actually listened to it became exporters. If all the 9,000 who listened became exporters, I would say that was a successful project. If none of them did, I would question its value for money. But that will depend on the review we have and the ability we have to get data.
Thank you. Faisal Rashid.
Thank you, Chair. You have told us that if the Trade Remedies Authority is not legally established at the point of a no-deal Brexit, its powers can be brought in-house as a shadow function within DIT. What impact would this have on Trade Remedies' capability and capacity?
None.
Nothing at all?
The same system would be operated. It would just operate inside the department until such times as the trade bill received royal assent. We laid down the SIs for that yesterday.
And what secondary legislation it would need?
The secondary legislation comes under the Customs Act, and it simply enables it to operate inside the department until it's given its status as a non-departmental public body under the trade bill. It's a contingency measure only.
So there is no, as such, secondary legislation needs to be...
Other than the ones that we laid yesterday, that would do it. Of course, we would want to have the trade bill given royal assent as soon as possible, but in terms of the actual functions of the TRA, they would be the same people operating the same rules from the same place with the same information basis.
And no impact on any functionality or capacity or capabilities? No? Okay.
Thank you. Marcus Fish, you might find this a more appropriate
spot
for your trade remedies and tariffs.
Well, just to follow on with the trade remedies, I welcome the work that your department's been doing on that. I think the contingency planning around whether or not we have the trade bill and being able to operate those in any event, I think is very welcome. And I think it's quite a contrast, really, with some of the ways that it seems that the normal tariff schedules are not being outlined in the same way, which I will grant is not your responsibility. It is HMRC's. But why do you think that the Secretary of State for Business on the radio this morning said that the tariff schedule would only be announced once we knew that we were leaving without a deal on 29th of March?
Well, so the timing will be a collective one, and I've not been party to any discussions on timing that would lead me to that definite conclusion, but it's always possible that someone else knows more than I do.
I mean, is it not surprising, though, for someone like him, who is supposed to be looking after the interests of business, to be willing to leave them in the dark over this issue right up to the wire?
Well, it is a question of timing, and as I say, it's a collective decision.
Yeah. Just coming back to the question about whether any application of such a schedule would interfere with future trade negotiations. Could you say a little about whether a temporary application of rates, for example, for a year or for 2 years, could in fact encourage potential free trade partners to want to confirm those lower rates in a free trade agreement within such a temporary period?
Oh, it's a very clever attempt to ensnare me in the details of what we might or might not announce. But I think it is fair to say that in terms of future FTA partners, they would want to know whether any arrangement that was announced was a temporary or a permanent one.
Yeah. And I wondered if you could also say a little bit about within such a future framework, when we have our quotas for imports of certain goods without tariffs, whether opening quota that we would potentially otherwise have given to the EU if we had a deal with them to the rest of the world on an erga omnes basis might be an interesting and advantageous thing for us to pursue.
It is an interesting subject which, as I mentioned in the answer to the earlier question, would have to be part of a wider architecture question about what was the balance between the access to the European market and what we were willing to accept in terms of the FEP and what we would want in terms of freedom for free trade agreements elsewhere. There, as I've often said, there's a balance to be struck here. We 44% of our exports still go to the European Union. We need to have good access to that very important market for the United Kingdom, but in a way that doesn't tie our hands to having access to other markets that might be growing more quickly.
And just finally, would you expect the EU to want to preserve its markets for exporting into the UK without tariffs, rather than see those markets go to some other countries without tariffs?
Well, I mean, if in court I would have said that was leading the witness. But it's undoubtedly true that the UK, as the world's 5th biggest economy, is a very big market. I think it is worth just saying, however, that the European Commission doesn't sell to the British government. Producers sell to customers, and they will look to the most advantageous market conditions.
Thank you. Just following on from tariffs, before I move to Nigel Evans, will there be a full consultation on any tariff changes?
In terms of long-term tariff policy, of course there needs to be.
But will you introduce tariffs without any consultation? I mean, if tariffs are changed, other than following the European Union's tariff schedule, I mean, on what basis will tariffs be arrived at? I mean, business would love to know this.
In the event that we have an agreement with the European Union, there will be plenty of time for us to have a full consultation about what our long-term tariff policy should be. If we leave the European Union on the 29th of March, for example, with no deal at the other end of the spectrum, it would be necessary to introduce emergency tariffs. I think that's just...
You've had 2.5 years to get to this point. And you're telling me that there's no thought of consultation or work being done on possible tariffs?
No, that's not at all what I said.
On the 29th. So what work has happened then? So if we leave it on the 29th of March with no deal, what's happening with the tariffs? If the work's happened, you can tell us.
The government will set out what it believes to be the appropriate tariff policy, taking into account a number of factors. What would be the potential cost input shock if we had to go to full MFN rates, for example, with the European Union. We'd also have to take into account what would happen to business in terms of their exposure to unexpected competition, were we to go to total liberalisation. And the third element we have to take into account is loss of preferential treatment and preference erosion. So those are things that would have to be balanced.
I mean, this is a glaze over. What is happening with the work underneath when you're taking things into account? Who are you taking things into account with?
With the discussions we have across government,
so you've had
with the range of business.
Only across government, but not across business or industry about tariffs?
No, I said across government with business.
So there have been discussions with business about tariffs.
Well, we understand where our businesses are, and there need to be a range of things that have to be counterbalanced by government. Business won't have a view on preference erosion, for example, but they will have a view on what cost input would happen in terms of intermediate goods. So the government overall will have to balance a range of things. But a lot of these discussions in any detail, Chairman, as you well understand, are hugely commercially sensitive and market sensitive in terms of decisions that the government might take. So to preempt them in any detail would be in quite dangerous territory.
Because it's important that there's transparency and that the UK goes forward not with the bureaucrats or the clique in government, but on something as wide as that there's full consultation. And I ask about business because yesterday's Financial Times had the regular business meetings being cancelled. And would indicate that the channels operating with business aren't really operating as they should be.
No, not at all. My department, for example, our ITAs have hundreds of conversations a day with business and will continue to do so. We continue to give as best bespoke advice we can give to businesses. What you're referring to was a particular meeting where there were a number of different businesses involved where we had leakage of the advice that was given. We can best operate in an environment where the advice we give is kept confidential. I think everyone accepts that, and we will have to find the mechanisms to ensure we can give the most information that will help business, but in a way where the information is kept as confidential as we wish to seek it.
I mean, what sort of information was leaked that annoyed you? Because according to the Financial Times, business were infuriated by the lack of progress that's been going on.
It's to a point, Chairman, I would say immaterial. The fact is that information which is given on a confidential basis leaks. The nature of the information is less important than the leak. And we have to ensure, especially as we move forward and have to discuss quite sensitive details on future trade policy with business, we'll want to be assured that we're doing it on a confidential basis. I come from a professional background where we operated on the basis of confidentiality. I would like to think that extends further.
Briefly, Emma Little-Benguel and then Nigel Evans.
Just in relation to tariffs, in the situation of a no deal where some of the tariffs were relatively speaking high for some of the sectors, is it the case that the government can look at supporting those businesses by way of payment or additional support, which in some way would not directly compensate for the tariffs paid, but recognise that this is an additional cost to business, and therefore this additional support could support those businesses in the short to medium term until this issue is resolved?
That more than preempts what the government might attempt to do. But in theory, the government has a range of mechanisms to ensure that if there is any disruption to the market by change in tariffs or by change in currency value or by change in the competitive environment, that it could diminish that. Those are levers that are open to any government.
And just very quickly, and obviously I'm not asking you to give any detail about this, but is it something that's being discussed in terms of looking at this on a sector-by-sector basis to assess which of those sectors may be more adversely impacted by tariffs that may require some additional or specialist support in the short term?
I think there are well-known debates in the country about which sectors might be more vulnerable to sudden competition from outside, some industries that take longer to turn around. And I know that agriculture is very clearly in the mind of those representing seats in Northern Ireland, as in other parts of the country, like my own. And there are a number of ways in which the government would be able to mitigate any changes. Further than that, it would be imprudent for me to say.
I'm going to indulge Marcus this. He's promised and given his word in one question.
I apologise, I need to go to another meeting. But can I encourage you as a member of the government to think hard about whether it is fair or even appropriate to be prioritising the sort of commercial sensitivities of business and secrecy and I guess the procedural niceties and ambitions of the government in terms of getting its deal through over giving Parliament the information about what the conditions of no deal would be when we're being potentially asked to vote on it next week?
I'm always open to encouragement.
Thank you. Nigel Evans.
The reporting on the radio this morning that as far as the tariff regime is concerned, post-no deal, that the Cabinet have now signed that off. Is that correct?
Well, there's been an agreement. It's always possible that there could be further changes, but there has been a basic agreement, yes.
And there's been no leaks about that. Who would have thought?
Well, I'm not sure we'd be having this conversation about what was reported on the radio or the FT had there been no discussions about what was actually said.
Yeah, well, normally one reads on Twitter or indeed in newspapers exactly what normally goes on in Cabinet, so it's incredible that at least that's...
there are days where I find it easier, quicker, to read the next day's newspapers than wait for the Cabinet minutes. That's indeed true.
Looking at the trade defence measures, there's about 109 that you've looked at and decided that 43 would be maintained as part of an independent UK trade policy. Why have you decided that you should carry on with those?
Some of the 109 were not directly applicable to the UK, and some didn't meet the criteria that we set out for the objective passing of the test. But we thought that the methodology that we set out was a fair and reasonable one, and I'm very pleased with the reaction that we've got, particularly from some of the important sectors of our economy like steel and ceramics, who were very much welcoming of the way that the government had carried out the process, as well as the outcome of the process itself.
Can you just sort of add a little bit more to that? So what sort of, you've mentioned ceramics and steel, is it because of the relationship between European Union defence manufacturers that you've decided to go down this route?
John?
Well, I was just picking up the point about defence manufacturers. I wasn't quite sure. I mean, these are a range of industries, and we look at the impact that was previously found by the
defensive measures, not defence industry.
Yeah. No, I mentioned defence because I've got BAE Systems in my patch as well.
I don't think there are anything...
the generality.
Yes, so that's what I was picking up. I don't think there's anything... I mean, we looked at the measures and where the UK industry was significant and affected, and the measures that the EU originally took were important for the UK industry, and we had consultations with them, and they made their case, and then we assessed it, and that was what led to the result the Secretary of State just announced. So it was a range of different sectors. It wasn't related to defence equipment particularly.
You've mentioned ceramics as one of them. Do you think that some of the measures, therefore, that you are taking will make it more difficult to do trade deals, perhaps with other countries, because of the defensive measures you're taking?
No, these were trade remedies put in place because we believe there was already a case of an unfair trade practice by one or other countries, and these are designed to take us back to, if you like, to an equilibrium, to ensure that there is fair trade taking place. So we were doing no more and no less than we had previously been doing under the European Union.
And of those ones that you've decided not to adopt, have you had representation from any businesses within the United Kingdom with deep concerns about the fact that you have not given any protection there?
John?
I mean, I think, so obviously we had a number of representations, but we did... I think I'm correct in saying we went round this a number of times to make sure that if any business was concerned about the continuity of measures, they had sort of ample opportunity to make those points. And as the Secretary of State said, I think generally the reaction to the decisions we took has been pretty positive. So the businesses...
Yeah, but that doesn't really answer my question. Have you had any representation since to say there's deep concern?
So one particular case would be Brompton, the electrical bikes, and our officials actually visited them yesterday to have discussions with how we could help them, and where companies fail to meet the market threshold of 1%, if they are not more than 1% of the UK market, we think it's unreasonable to apply the trade remedies in those cases. We have to have a threshold somewhere. We think that's a reasonable level.
Okay.
So, just to clarify, what does that mean for Brompton Cycles?
That the trade remedy was not applied.
For them, so they would be left exposed?
Well, so we were discussing with them how we might best be able to help them, for example, by increasing export help for them, to be able to compete fairly.
How did they take this information?
Well, naturally, anyone that isn't covered is disappointed, but we had set out a very clear methodology.
I would imagine. Matt Weston.
Just on that, to say, the interview with Will Butler Adams was very interesting in what he was saying. And was it 1% or 2%? I picked up it was actually, 1%. But we have Pashy Bikes in Warwickshire as well that is a very successful local business. And other businesses coming back in production. It seems when we've got growing manufacturing sectors like that, it's surprising that we seem to be willing to leave them very exposed to the market. I understand what you've just said, but there are real profound concerns amongst the manufacturing sector that they will be very vulnerable to your negotiations.
We also have to ensure that we're being WTO compliant and we're not applying protections to our businesses that we can't defend on an international basis.
Okay. When we met a month ago, I think there was a persistent questioning about where we were up to in terms of the rollover of trade agreements. And I think you had a sheet of paper in front of you which I highlighted about the colours on it, and you said, sadly, I'm colourblind, so I would be very unaware of the document in front of me and what it actually meant in terms of the success of where you were at in terms of the status of those agreements. It subsequently became clear that we were in very poor shape, or you were in very poor shape in terms of the progress you were making, and it was leaked to the Sun newspaper, which great that they actually covered it and gave it the sort of air that it needed. The fact that it was then briefed to businesses in the afternoon of that same day, was that not discourteous to this committee and maybe to me?
I don't think that what was leaked was actually an accurate representation. I think what I set out was, and I'll repeat it, that the trade that we do under our free trade agreements as a member of the European Union is about 11% of our trade. Of that proportion, about 3.5% was zero tariff and would occur anyway. Of the remaining, around about 8%, 7.5%, 8%, we have already above 25% of that signed. We have a number of other agreements ready, and we have a number of potential mitigation measures and contingency measures in place should some of those other countries not be ready to do so. So, no, I think actually, in terms of continuity of trade, that we're well placed. The one thing that, of course, is holding that back is the lack of certainty of trading partners about whether we will have a deal with the European Union, in which case they don't need to have those continuity agreements.
But to be fair, Secretary of State, my question was actually about whether you were being discourteous about sharing that information in the afternoon with businesses, but you weren't prepared to share it to this forum.
I think as I said, some of the information that was leaked was not particularly accurate.
Okay. Just to move on, at that briefing, I understand that your officials explained that the agreements with Turkey and Japan, among others, were not going to be possible to be completed before March 2019. Can you just explain how many agreements actually fall under that category, and how much UK trade will be affected if there is a no-deal Brexit?
Well, I set out in the WMS which countries would be affected, and the statement I made to the House of Commons, and answered those questions in the House of Commons. In the case of Turkey, of course, Turkey is in a partial customs union with the European Union, which sets out the dangers of being in a customs union where you have trade policy applied to you without having a voice on the issue. And of course, therefore, apart from the elements with Turkey where they are not part of the partial customs union, on services and agriculture, for example, there would be a limit to what we could do in terms of agreement. John might want to comment on where we are with those elements of it. Other than that, we have to wait to see where we are with the European Union. In terms of Japan, I don't think it has much impact on our trade, because all of our trade with Japan for the last 30-odd years or more has been under WTO terms. The Japan EPA only came into existence on the 1st of February. So all our historic trade with Japan has been on the basis of WTO trade. And in fact, some of the liberalisation that would come in under the Japan EPA wouldn't come into effect till January 2020. And some of the tariff liberalisation is 6 or 7 years later on that. The question for the UK would be, would it be beneficial in the event of a no deal, which I repeat yet again, we don't want to see, because in the event of a deal we get rollover of the EPA. But in the event of no deal, would our businesses notice that they were doing business on exactly the same basis that they had been doing for the last 30 years? Probably not. And would there be advantages in doing a bilateral agreement with Japan that went beyond the EPA? Probably.
Can I just add one?
And John.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify the 3.5% which you referred to earlier. So it's 3.5% is actually the preferences of that 11%. So it's 3.5% of our goods trade which is covered by preferences.
Okay, thank you for that. And can I just finally ask, if there is a delay to Article 50 through the votes of next week, how will that affect your ability to roll over the agreements? And how long would such delay need to be in order to ensure a proper rollover of all of them?
Well, if there was, as has been indicated, a potentially short and one-off delay to Article 50, I think it would certainly make it very clear to those who are negotiating with us what the cliff edge might be in that case, and provide some incentive to get our agreements done. If we end up, which I would think would be the most detrimental outcome to the UK of an Article 50 extension that's in one way or another resulting in us not leaving the European Union, then that's a different case altogether.
But given your experience of the last, 2 years, you must have an idea of how long it would take.
Well, it's of course, it's a question of the incentive that our trading partners have to come to that agreement. So, I mean, for some of our trading partners, they will say, why should we invest? And to some extent show our hand of what would be our negotiating position for a future FTA in this agreement when we don't have to. So they're waiting again, and not unreasonably, I have to say, to see whether Parliament is going to vote for a deal or not.
So Lord Price was wrong?
I wouldn't criticise Lord Price.
Just picking up from a point there, you said that the leak was inaccurate that was in the Sun.
Sorry?
The leak that was in the Sun was inaccurate at the beginning of February.
Some of the countries mentioned are much further and much better progressed than that seemed to suggest.
Well, what was leaked was the Department of International Trade slide on the state of play. Our Department of International Trade slides information, are they inaccurate?
Well, it depends. They're snapshots. It depends on what day. The point I was just making to Mr. Weston is that these things move on. And on any one day, you'll get a slightly different picture from the day before or the day after.
So the shelf life of a Department of International Trade communications is about a day?
Well, this is we have to understand this is a real-time exercise that we're engaged in, and things will change from day to day, and we make progress from day to day with these agreements. That's not at all unreasonable.
In the real-time happening, you mentioned that Switzerland was a country where there was rollover, and that had been secured. But it's not full transition, is it? There are gaps.
Well, of course, there isn't a single trade agreement that Switzerland has with the European Union. These are a number of agreements that have come into existence over the years. So the point was to put as many of these together into a single document as possible to provide as great certainty as possible. John was involved with that. He might want to comment on any specifics on that.
Can you tell us what the gaps are, especially in the event of a no deal?
So, I mean, we set out in the report, I don't have all the details in my head just now, but we set it out in the report that we put alongside the text of the agreement. So the explanations of where there are any differences with the EU arrangements.
It's not quite what the headline said, though, is it?
Well, it is a substantial replication of the agreement.
It's substantial, it's not full.
Well, of course, it's what we said the process would be, that we would publish the text, that we would publish the explanatory memorandum, and we would set out where there were differences. We have published those in there for the House to scrutinise.
Well, when we were told here a month ago it was full, it wasn't full, it was substantial.
Well, as we set in detail, all members of Parliament had an opportunity to look at them.
Do you think the use of the word full was wrong a month ago? Would substantial have been a better word, as Mr. Alty has used this morning?
Well, we've always said it was a technical replication of agreements in as far as we could do them, as far as it was possible to be able to do that.
We know there are gaps now. Julia Lopez, would you like to come in?
You referenced Turkey a little earlier in response to Mr. Weston, and you said they're in a partial customs union and they don't have a voice on trade policy. Now, as you know, one of my concerns about the backstop is the customs arrangements that we would be in, and the political declaration referencing those customs arrangements as the blueprint for the future relationship. I wonder, in that scenario, would we have a voice, for instance, on trade policy when it comes to agricultural tariffs? Would we be able to have conversations with other trade partners? As you know, Turkey has not been permitted to talk to the UK during this whole withdrawal process. How would you envisage that we would be able to have a voice on our own trade policy if we were in a future customs relationship or partial customs union with the EU?
In a customs union, we'd be subjected to common external tariffs. We would, of course, be allowed to negotiate and sign but not implement any free trade agreements that applied to the point at which we left the European Union. That, of course, being the point which is the estimate of what the risk is of the backstop ever coming into existence.
But given that there is a risk of that, as has been discussed ad nauseum, does that concern you about the potential that we could have a future independent trade policy?
Well, on the backstop, without wanting to go back over the whole debate again on the backstop, it is, of course, it's a point of concern, but it's weighed against the what we believe the risk is of the backstop ever coming into existence for a number of other reasons, including the unwillingness of other countries to be locked into trading relationships they don't want.
Rather than talk about the Chequers proposals and the fact that the Prime Minister envisaged that we would be in a goods-only or agricultural-only customs arrangement with the EU. Do you think that would limit our ability to have an independent trade policy?
Not at the end of the period, but clearly if you're in a customs union, you are exposed to the common external tariff. That's what it is.
So does that concern you as the International Trade Secretary?
It doesn't constrain us in terms of what we can negotiate beyond that period, but clearly in that period we would have our hands tied in a way that we wouldn't were we not to be subjected to a common external tariff. It
was my understanding from the Czechs policy that would be the future relationship, that the Prime Minister, it's her preference to have that as the future relationship, so this wouldn't be a transitional issue.
No, I think that it's worth looking at the wording of the political declaration, which says it's build and improve upon in line with the principles and objectives set out, which include an independent trade policy.
The Chairman requested that we receive the draft agreement text and the corresponding parliamentary report every time a rollover agreement is initialled. You said to us that this is not appropriate, and we wonder why, given by your own admission, only final legal checks, translation and minor changes then remain to be done.
Under the UK procedure, the first Parliament gets first sight of that as soon as it's signed, and Parliament as a whole gets the first ability to see that.
Can we as a committee expect to be notified when an agreement is initialled, as requested by the Chairman?
There's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't happen. In fact, I can give a guarantee that we will do that.
Very good. Thank you. Just before I move to Faisal Rashid, yesterday there were members of Parliament from the North Macedonian Parliament in town. North Macedonia is a small country, but the UK has a huge trade surplus with it. They described the talks that they've been having with the UK government that had suddenly stalled. There have been 2 rounds of talks and no progress, also affecting Albania, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Where are these talks at the moment?
A lot of those talks are being led by the Foreign Office because they're association agreements with a strong political element to them, but they obviously have trade elements as well, which we advise on. So as far as I'm aware, the Foreign Office is continuing to hold and conduct those discussions with those countries. I don't have the detail of precisely where they are because we're not leading on them.
We would have, Chairman, and I'm happy to do that to, if the committee wants to get an update from the FCO as to where. I am not aware of why those reservations should be expressed by our Macedonian colleagues, but I can certainly find out and get a response to the committee.
Thank you, that would be appreciated. The Freight Transport Association are asking which countries have already confirmed that they will treat the EU as an EU member state during the transition period. Which countries will treat the UK as an EU member state during the transition period?
As it's a question of the EU deeming that the UK is still a party to those agreements. There's no question of
which third countries have confirmed that they will treat the UK as an EU member state during the transition period.
I'm not aware from the conversations we've had with the Commission that any country has said it will not. And that's entirely understandable, because why would a country want to exclude such a large market from an agreement to which it's already a party?
But have you had any confirmation?
We don't seek confirmation on that.
Wow, okay. Then the question arises about goods that are in travel and transit that might arrive after the 28th of March, to say Japan and Korea. How will the Japanese and the Koreans treat these goods if there's a transition after the 28th of March? Do you have any idea, given you've not sought any confirmation?
Well, no, if there is an agreement with the European Union, and Japan has already said it will roll over the Japan-EU EPA, to which we are a party, and we expect that the automaticity of the process.
And South Korea?
If there is an agreement with the European Union, then again it will be covered by the EU-South Korea agreement. If there is no...
Have the South Koreans confirmed that?
If there is... Yes, in fact they have.
When?
But when I've spoken to the South Koreans, I've visited South Korea, who've made it very clear that in the event of a deal with the European Union, they would want to see an automatic rollover of the provisions of that during the IP.
Is this in writing? Or just a fellow in South Korea said to you?
Well, it's not. It's the discussions I've had with trade ministers who are not just other fellows. They happen to be respected colleagues internationally. And they've made it very clear that what they want is continuity.
And the final question that the Freight Transport Association are asking, that I can indulge in this setting this morning, is what actual duty rates will apply to each item imported to the UK, given what you've said about the Cabinet signing things off? The crucial part of the question is, are there any differences to the current rates currently applied under the EU's Common Customs Tariff?
I can't comment on specific tariffs, Chairman.
So you've signed off. I'm not asking for specific tariff commentary. I'm asking, are there any changes to what you've signed off?
No, I can't answer that question. That's a breach of collective responsibility.
So there might be changes to the Common Customs Tariff, or there might not be changes. We've got 24
well, I think it's a fair
days
assumption that there might be or there might not be. That's a fair
with 24 days
summation.
to go. The Freight Transport Association would like to know with 24 days to go.
Yes, and as I mentioned earlier, the timing is an issue of collective responsibility. It would be completely inappropriate for me on such a sensitive issue, the reasons for which I've explained earlier, to comment on what changes there may or may not be.
My final question is, when might the Freight Transport Association know of the changes in the next, of any changes between the EU's Common Customs Tariffs and the UK?
Well, as I've said earlier, it's a matter for collective responsibility, but as I've also said earlier, my personal view is it would be helpful for MPs in making a decision about what they thought about no deal, to have as much information in front of them as possible.
There will be a sharp intake of breath at the FT. Now, there's interest from Catherine West and Sir Mark Kendall. Catherine West first.
So just to press you on this, Secretary of State, what date will the announcement be made about the tariffs? At what date is the Cabinet going to announce the levels, so that there's some certainty, not just for this committee, which is already bristling under the fact that we had to check the Swiss government's website in order to find details of the arrangement between Switzerland and the UK, but also for all the companies which have contacted us, or the trade groups which we've had given us evidence. It's just getting to the point where it's rude.
Well, I already explained that the procedure in the UK is that we make Parliament as a whole available, has the ability to see what agreements we make, which is why we publish, when we have the finished text, and we publish it for Parliament. Now, there's been no attempt by any government of any colour to change that procedure and to give information not to Parliament as a whole. So that's been established process in our country for a long time. I don't know if the opposition may have plans to change that, but if there are, I've not heard them expressed in the House of Commons. And in terms of publication, as I've said several times, I'm sorry that you weren't there for that part of the discussion, but said that this is an issue for Treasury. The Treasury will lay the SI in terms of tariffs. This is not a responsibility of DIT.
So, Margaret.
Chair, I mean, you can probably help me with this question. When we were in Japan, a number of different players, not least our own embassy, made it clear that it's not necessarily the case that the EU agreement will be a simple rollover to a UK-Japan agreement, because there are very great differences in, obviously, interests within the EU 27 that are not necessarily the same as those in the UK. Also, our leverage by not being within the European Union will be that much more diminished. How can you make such a categoric statement where you feel it will be such a straightforward rollover?
No, I think that's mistaking two things. One is that if we have an agreement with the EU and we go into an implementation period, the government of Japan have made it clear that they would want to see the full
if we have an agreement with the EU,
of the Japan EPA under which the UK
what if we don't have a deal with the EU?
In the case of there being no deal, as I explained earlier, the government of Japan has expressed to us a very clear preference to move to a bilateral agreement, because there are areas, for example, as I mentioned earlier today, on issues such as data movement, particularly the limitations placed by the EU on data localization, where the UK would be more flexible, and the Japanese government, being a very service-orientated economy, can see that as being a benefit. So, but what both countries have said is that the Japan-EU EPA would be a useful basis for a future bilateral agreement.
Well, it could be a starting point, but then again, zero could be a starting point. It depends how the Japanese government wants to look at it, but certainly our embassy over there weren't as optimistic as you are.
No, I can tell you that from my direct discussions with the Japanese government. Both governments have said they see the EU-Japan EPA as being a sound basis for a UK-Japan future trade agreement.
A starting point.
Well, they say it as a substantial basis, and with good reason. And the government of Japan is very optimistic about potential timescales of reaching agreement on that, because there's such a strong reason to believe that the Japan-EU EPA would be a good basis for it. And both Prime Minister Abe and our Prime Minister have made very clear that they see that new bilateral relationship based on that agreement as being a priority.
Well, that's positive, but you would accept it's not a rollover then?
It is a rollover in the case that we get an implementation period and an agreement with the EU. That becomes a rollover agreement.
I mean,
but in terms,
about no
if we are not, if there is no deal, then there will be a new agreement.
Just to clarify, I'm glad that the committee will see agreements at initialisation. I'm just looking at the Swiss agreement. It was then initialled, but it was signed on the 11th of February and laid before Parliament on the 20th of February. Why the gap of 9 days? And do you think that could be shortened between the signing of an agreement and laid before Parliament?
Yeah, I would hope it would be, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Faisal Rashid.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, Financial Times reported on 17th of February that according to Japanese officials, there have been several occasions when British negotiators have come to the table without the necessary specialists to take negotiations forward. What is that, and what are you doing about it?
Well, I'm not aware of I've not had any complaints from my Japanese colleagues of that being the case. But I'm sure that avid readers of the FT will be getting a whole range of different information.
Well, you have any issues with recruitment of specialist negotiators? Or?
We have not been short of the discussions we've had with Japan. Where we have come to is exactly as I've described. Were we to have a future FTA with Japan, we couldn't negotiate that until we left the EU in any case.
Okay.
Just very briefly.
Trust and respect are clearly very important in Japanese culture. Are you fearful that there seems to have been a sense from their side that we no longer have as much respect, or they have less respect and trust in us?
No, I don't feel that at all. And my discussions with my Japanese colleagues have always been extremely warm and productive. And in fact, I was very honoured when I was in Japan last year that Prime Minister Abe broke his holiday to have a meeting, which I regarded as a sign of the utmost respect with which the Japanese government held the UK.
Importance, probably, yes.
I think it's just worth making the point that trade isn't simply about economics. Trade is also about politics, and it's also about strategic relationships. And I think that in terms of the UK-Japan relationship, a future trading agreement between us is part of a wider strategic relationship and is seen as such.
Okay. Just on that point, how do you think the Japanese will really feel when they've invested in a country on the basis that it was the gateway into the single market, the customs union? They put 40% of their investments in that trading bloc into a particular country. And then that country says, oh, we're leaving the customs union, the single market behind. Don't you think mildly annoyed, a little bit upset?
Well, I think that's probably the reason why so many of the Japanese car companies have been very vocal in supporting the government's proposed agreement with the European Union. And I think those who want to see jobs maintained in the car industry, particularly those who represent areas where the car industry is very strong, might want to take account of what those companies are telling us. Indeed, they want to stay in the customs union and single market for another 21 months, which is what your withdrawal agreement would do. Do you think that they want to be out of the customs union and the single market after 21 months and month 22? I don't speak for Japanese car companies. What they will want to ensure is they get the best access to the markets that matter to them, and they will take into account those circumstances. They will also take into account the fact that in the United Kingdom they've got amongst the best technology and amongst the most skilled workers to produce the vehicles that they have. And the single market to them. I'm sorry? How important do you think the customs union and the single market is? It is clearly a factor, but it also is a factor, as I say, the environment for manufacturing in the UK. And I think sometimes the market that we're selling into is overplayed in relation to the reason why many of these companies are in the UK, not just the skill of our workforce and the quality of what they produce, but also the access to the supply chains in the UK, which will be increasingly important in the car industry as we move towards EVs and AVs, where the UK has a lot of that supply chain technology. Supply chains are about 2,000 lorries a day coming out the single market.
Just very briefly, Secretary of State, yes, I do represent a constituency where the automotive industry is significant. And you're saying that if any member should be voting for the government's deal. The truth is, amongst manufacturing industry, they want to stay in the customs union and a single market. They do not like the deal, but it's the only thing on the table, and it's the way the government has negotiated, particularly the Prime Minister, that really concerns them. It's being presented as a fait accompli. That's why they're accepting it. They would really prefer not to.
Well, of course, they may prefer for us not to leave the European Union, but the people of Britain have voted to leave the European Union. That's it. And if we were to stay in the customs market, customs union and the single market, that would be a question of what we'd left.
And we're seeing the consequences.
Britain being led by your government because they voted to leave the European Union, not the customs union, the single market. Nigel Evans.
Looking at the rollover with Switzerland and rules of origin, which are clearly very important, and diagonal accumulation, which I've just read through, which is complex to say the least, but I understand why you want to go down this route. Now, this is an agreement based on the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention, which is apparently signed by 23 contracting parties, including clearly the EU, and then a number of others. Is it our intention to accede to this convention?
So, the government hasn't yet decided whether to accede or not, so it's definitely a possibility, but that's something that we will be discussing and are discussing with businesses who are interested, but there hasn't been a decision yet.
So there's no decision at the moment. But if we were to do so, Secretary of State, do you think the American problem might arise again because they're not so keen on these rules of origin, are they?
Well, we think that the agreements we've got on rules of origin make sense in terms of continuity for business. When we come to future trade agreements with others, we'll have to, as a point I made earlier, weigh up a number of different factors about how closely we are aligned to any parts of European standards or other alignments versus the freedoms that we have for other free trade agreements. These are decisions that will come in the next phase.
I haven't the faintest idea whether Americans would classify sparkling wine as champagne at all. I don't know if you know that, Mr. Alty.
I think the Americans' views on GIs and ours are somewhat different.
Yeah, and that's what I'm getting to, which is that.
But this will occur these occur in any FTAs. This was a major element of the US-EU.
So basically, if they wanted to sell us that champagne which they produce in America, they would just have to relabel it. These
will be, I'm quite sure, endless discussions on the pros and cons in any FTA discussions that we get into. But way too early to preempt any of these arguments.
I finished.
Thank you. Secretary of State, there's concerns as well over preferences and developing countries, and bananas are a major part of the economy. Where would you, Secretary of State, lay consideration or lay emphasis on how this might affect, or any changes you might introduce affect developing countries?
Well, we want to ensure that developing countries get the same advantages that they get under GSP today. I'm not sure whether I mentioned it at the committee next time, and if I might be so bold as to make a suggestion to the committee that one of the areas I think that where single departmental scrutiny is not necessarily giving us the best results is on the interactions between trade and development. I would have thought there was a strong case for, I'm not even sure if it's possible, Chairman, for a joint investigation by DFID and this committee to look at where we could better align our trade and development policies. I think I might have given this example before, but if we look, for example, at the fact that a lot of those preferences give zero tariff, zero quota access to countries' primary commodities being sold into the EU, but not if they add value to those primary commodities. So if you can your fish, roast your coffee beans, you'll be subjected to a tariff. Now, it seems to me that it would be appropriate for us to try to tie trade and development more closely together. For example, my department is very keen on promoting outward direct investment. I would have thought that it made sense for us to look at that outward direct investment into some of those areas that would give countries, primarily in Africa, the ability to add value to their own produce. And then the secondary thing that we could do is use our tariff freedoms outside the EU to be able to bring down those tariffs on those value-added products. So, in other words, we're actually giving countries a greater ability to trade their way out of poverty than to require aid. It seems to me, Chairman, again, you tell me if I'm out of line on it, but I think that this is an area where neither the DFID committee nor this committee on its own has perhaps the bandwidth and might be a very useful area for committees to look at. Certainly the government, I know I would, and I'm sure the Secretary of State for International Development would welcome input into this.
Perhaps another look at our trade in developing countries report of November, when you can maybe spot any gaps, but we did take evidence from DFID as well as you know in the past.
And it was a very useful, if I may say, it's a very useful report, and we have taken on board some of those elements, and we're looking to see, we're going to write to the committee again on some of the elements. We're looking to see how much we can actually take on board ourselves as a department, and how much that would impinge upon the territory of DFID.
That'll be a welcome interaction. Emma Little-Pingelly, would like to come in.
Thank you. Firstly, can I apologise because there's Northern Ireland questions on now, so I need to leave very shortly. But I just wanted to ask about the interest at state level in the USA in terms of building the relationship with the UK. I have met with a number of delegations from various states, many of which are significant in terms of their economies and in their own right. And there does seem to be a keenness about trying to build that relationship, perhaps on a more formal basis, such as the signing of MOUs, the signing of documents in terms of the development of that relationship, and also what that could bring in terms of benefit to regions and the entire of the UK. So what consideration are you given? I understand that the Department is focusing at the moment in terms of the rollover of the EU third country trade deals, but have you given consideration to how we develop that, perhaps on a state-to-state basis, given the importance of state laws, not just federal laws, in terms of unlocking those relationships? So are you considering that? And also in terms of the trade envoy, the USA is obviously huge, and a lot of this will come down to relationships. Are you given any consideration to perhaps looking at putting looking at where the best opportunities lie in those particular states, and perhaps looking at identifying people who could work particularly with those states moving forward to alleviate the burden from just one state, the USA trade envoy?
It's a very important but very large question. And there tends to be a representation in the UK that the US, in dealing with trade with the US, is that we're dealing with a single homogeneous unit, when the point is well made that it's not.
I think the committee spoke to some of the state levels.
And so we have appointed a trade envoy to the US states, Mark Garnier, the former trade minister, to be working on that, building up some of those political relationships. I think that could go a lot further. I think we may need to expand that further. It's also one of the reasons why we set up the Trade Commissioner programme, because of the very reason that inside the United States, for example, you can have very different markets. And the three functions of the Trade Commissioners: to encourage foreign direct investment into the UK, to encourage outward direct investment from the UK, and to encourage UK exports, have a different mix in many different parts of the United States. That's why we opened our new trade offices in Minneapolis and San Diego and Raleigh-Durham. Not necessarily political centres, but they are trading centres. And I think it's really important, that's why, if it sounds terribly condescending to say this, it's a really, really good question, that we do have to alter how we think about these relationships, because a lot of that trading responsibility is held at state level in the US. And I completely agree that improving our understanding of the workings of some of those markets and the different elements and interactions in those markets is very key to us. I'm not sure if that was a job application as a trade envoy, but it sounded like it was coming perilously close.
Northern Ireland can be sold across the world very quickly. Mark Hendrick.
Secretary of State, we've been here now for nearly an hour and a half, and I think the elephant in the room, and very soon to be the largest economy in the world, will be China. But no mention of China. What are your aspirations for a trade deal with China at some stage in the future?
Well, we'd look to improve our relationship with China. There are a number of issues around market opening. So most of what we've been doing with China has been about market access rather than FTA. So, for example, since Northern Ireland is being mentioned, the agreement we did with China on dairy, a relatively small change about what type of milk was able to be incorporated into UK products, for example, was worth £250 million to the dairy industry in Northern Ireland. Our work recently, which helped Shell get the first international license in China, again, is a market opening issue. We have been working with our Chinese colleagues to, first of all, to get better UK access to exports. There are a number of problems there that are immediately apparent. If you look at UK goods and services exports to the world outside the EU, it's about 50-50. To China, it's only 18% services, because it's a very closed service market. And the point that we generally make is that you can only get to a trade agreement if your economies are sufficiently compatible, and there need to be changes made. And so issues around market access, particularly for services, but also around IP transfer, what we regard as forced tech transfer, these issues need to be resolved because they're not compatible with an FTA.
Just coming in on that, I mean, Germany, which is obviously going to stay in the EU, actually does, I think, something like 5 or 6 times the amount of trade than we do with China. On IP, something like 90% of copyright and IP judgments taking place in China, actually with Chinese companies, because they're very innovative now and they do a lot more of their own development. So, I mean, some of the fears we had in the past are no longer there. And for a country that says it wants to go global, when in fact you've got a country in the European Union that's doing 5 to 6 times more trade than the UK with China, surely, you know, you can be in the EU, all right, a decision's been made, but still be very successful in trade with a country like China.
Well, that's naturally true, that you don't have to be in or out of the EU to do trade with China. The problem there is with the market access issues.
I accept that, but there's, and the point you made about we want to focus on services is important, but you can do well with goods as well. And
we can do well with goods, and our exports to China in the last full year for which we got figures for 2017-18 was, I think it was 28.9% increase in our exports to China. We've been working very, very hard on that, for example, by the high profile that we had at the CIIE, the expo at Shanghai. I had 5 visits to China last year with a successful Joint Economic and Trade Committee. We're awaiting the Chancellor's visit on other economic issues. So we have been making a lot of progress. I think if you're looking at the manufacturing exports, of course Germany as an exporting economy is much more an export manufacturer in goods than it is in services, while we're the reverse. So for us, the important market access issue will be services.
Thank you. You must have been as frustrated as the Chancellor with the Defence Secretary then, but I won't ask you to comment on that, given the measures we've had on
you could try to.
Cabinet responsibility. But I can detect frustration across government with the Defence Secretary. Secretary of State, under Section 22 of CRAG, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, a treaty can be ratified without coming before Parliament. The Brexit Secretary has told the Chair of the Procedures Committee that the Government cannot exclude the possibility of using Section 22 in, and he said, an exceptional case. So, Secretary of State, what would such a case be, an exceptional case?
Well, the general presumption is that the normal process with 21 working days would be applied. What would be exceptional would be if we were leaving the EU and there was a threat to trade continuity and we wanted to ensure that that could happen. I would think leaving the EU without an agreement on the 29th of March would definitely come under exceptional circumstances.
Okay, so the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders are interested in what the Department's agreed with the EU and its trading partners about what will happen to goods already in transit should the UK leave the EU without a deal.
John.
Mr. Rotty.
This is really generous.
It seems to be a game of doubles tennis here. Sometimes.
Well, clearly, you know, it will depend on the terms in which the UK leaves. I can't give you it is a sort of HMRC issue, but I mean, we can give you more.
There have been discussions on that. We don't take the departmental lead on that, Jim. Again, if you wish us to be in touch with HMRC, we can give you a better detailed answer to that question.
Yeah, I think the Society of Motor Manufacturing Traders would like to know that. Secretary of State, you also told us last month that in case the trade bill is not passed by the 29th of March, you've got contingency plans for measures to facilitate trade agreement continuity. I know exactly what contingency measures will allow you to make legislative changes that are required for or required by rollover agreements.
Well, there are three elements of the trade bill that we said we required the trade bill for trade continuity, for trade remedies, and for GPA, which we haven't touched upon today. We have laid the SIs already for the Trade Remedies Authority and continuity and how that will be done under the TRID. When it comes to GPA, again, we will lay the appropriate legislation in Parliament to do that. When it comes to trade agreements, we hope, of course, to end as I began, that we will have an agreement with the European Union, and therefore those agreements will automatically be deemed to roll over, and we will get total trade continuity with all of those agreements. That is the government's preferred option. If we can't, we will use the CRAG process where we can, and we are looking at some contingency measures which we will bring to Parliament shortly when we are convinced that.
So you can't outline the contingency measures today. Is that what you're saying?
I would rather wait until we have had further discussion and they have reached a level of fruition.
You'd rather you told us now.
Yes, I'm well aware of that.
Okay. I see what we're going to get with that, and given time. But you said you're looking to end, but not quite yet. I know we might all be anxious to end, but you will have received we've received your response to our trade policy transparency and scrutiny report, which we have today published online. At present, many of the proposed consultative arrangements that you've committed to are not in place, such as finalising membership of the Strategic Trade Advisory Group and updating the Memorandum of Understanding with the devolved administrations and establishing the new Intergovernmental Ministerial Forum. Secretary of State, could you be walking into major trade negotiations quite soon, in a matter of weeks, in fact, without proper advice from those who stand to be affected?
The Strategic Advisory Group is almost complete in terms of cross-government agreement on the members of that. I'm hoping to do a WMS on that hopefully in the next week and write to all the members who we would like to invite. The thing it's just worth saying, Chairman, about the Strategic Advisory Group is that the names when they're published may come as a little bit of a surprise, in that they may seem to range more widely across the political spectrum than might normally be expected. The whole point...
Is Len McCluskey one of those surprises?
Well, I mean, dangerous to hold your breath. But it certainly will include trade union representation. The whole point of the STAG, the Strategic Advisory Group, is to provide the government with an input that wouldn't necessarily be associated with a Conservative government. It's to provide NGOs and trade unions and businesses all with a say on what the strategic trading environment should look like. I hope that when we publish it, that people will be pleasantly surprised at how encompassing it is.
There's about 24 days to go to Brexit, but in November you told us that the Minister for Trade Policy stated actually that it wasn't you. The membership of the Strategic Trade Advisory Group would be announced within the month. That was November. 3 months has gone, and you're saying it's about to be done. When will it be done?
As I say, shortly. Hopefully we'll be able to lay out...
Within the month?
Hopefully to do a WMS within the week, Chairman.
Within the week?
If we are able to get... First of all, of course, we have to have agreement of the members themselves before we publish it. But I would hope that that could be done as expeditiously as possible.
Thank you. On the 21st of February, you scheduled one general debate on 4 potential future FTAs with Australia, New Zealand, US and CPTPP, the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Can you assure us that Parliament will be given opportunities to debate outline approaches in respect of negotiations for each of those agreements individually?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I thought it was a very good debate, but I thought that the level of interest shown by Parliament in such an important subject was extremely disappointing, and the number of members who turned up to discuss those 4 big potential FTAs I thought was disappointing. So the government will publish its outline approach and objectives, including a scoping assessment and the initial economic analysis, and then Parliament will have a role in scrutinising the outline approach. Mm-hmm. The key element, Chairman, where we don't have the final piece of the jigsaw in place is what committee or committees in one or both houses we will use to scrutinise those agreements, and what powers those committees might have to call for a debate on any element of that trade agreement. Okay. I know you and I have had a brief conversation on that. I've had the same with my opposition numbers. I hope that we can come to an agreement quite soon, because I think, although this is not universally a view held by all governments, that strong scrutiny in real time by respected parliamentarians adds to the strength of our trade case. It doesn't weaken it. And all governments should remember that no government is in government forever. And scrutiny powers that may be irritating to government can be saviours for oppositions.
And I think you wouldn't say it, but the Prime Minister might have been better following that approach rather than returning to Parliament with a fait accompli and trying to bounce Parliament into an agreement. I know you wouldn't say anything about that.
There are some words, Chairman, you simply cannot put it.
Not here. I would comment on the debate, and you're right, it was sparsely attended. It was a Thursday, but it was in a formal recess, and it looked like it was a filler debate, which was disappointing. But I think you might remember my quip on the day that perhaps some of the Brexiteer Tories were in Val d'Isère taking advantage of maybe their last February break under freedom of movement. We might want to leave that there too. Catherine West.
Thank you, Chair. You've stated your commitment to transparency in trade negotiations, but you've been consistently resistant to putting any commitment on a statutory footing. Given the considerable public concern about transparency and your own words about it just now, and your department's poor record in this regard, because I'm sure that the officers are aware, the staff are aware, that I think it's the lowest performing government department at responding to freedom of information requests. On what basis should this committee trust your commitments?
I think because we promised that we would have a public consultation, and a consultation that would be longer than the European Union, and we delivered on that. We promised that Parliament would have the opportunity to debate those issues once the consultation was finished. We will be having 2 publications. We will be having the publication of the public's response to the consultations, and we will have a government response to each of the 4 of those individually, and then we will have that process that I set out and was set out in the command paper last week, and I hope that we'll get cross-party support for genuine scrutiny of a new process. As we leave the European Union, scrutinising new free trade agreements will be a new function of both government and Parliament. And I hope that when we do these things, that when we give Parliament the opportunity, Parliament will avail itself of the opportunity better than it did the week before last.
Will those transparency commitments be put on a statutory footing, yes or no?
Oh, in terms of committee, that's quite a way from being decided yet. We will want to decide, having spoken to opposition parties in both houses, how we take that forward.
So that's another thing that's not decided?
Well, I can decide a lot of things, but I cannot decide the opposition party's views.
So the transparency commitments that have been made to this committee will not be put on a statutory footing, or they will be, or you haven't decided?
In terms of how we handle the future scrutiny, no decisions have been made.
Thank you. Sir Mark Henry. Time is getting short.
Yes, I could just say, you previously told us that inward investment rose by 20% in the UK last year. However, we've also heard that data which relates specifically to greenfield investment into the UK suggests that this has declined since 2016. Now, in making such statements, why do you not distinguish between greenfield investment and mergers and acquisitions?
Well, what I was referring to were the UNCTAD figures and the Deloitte figures from their published reports, which were very widely regarded. It's correct that you can get big distortions in inward investment from M&A activity. That's true. I would be very happy to share with the committee any detailed information that we've got on any disaggregation of that data, for which we hold quite a lot.
Well, Dr. Henry Lowendahl, Chief Executive Officer of the company WaveTech, told this committee that the DIT's database on foreign direct investment projects is rather suspect, in inverted commas. He said that there is a huge problem with the DIT data because you do not track how many companies close down or how many companies downsize. How do you respond to that statement?
Well, we can only make judgments on the data that's available and whether that is kept centrally or not. One of our big problems, I think I've shared with the committee before, is access to trade data and business data. That does need to improve. That was one of the elements that's been in our legislation recently to give us better access to that data. But of course, what I was talking about was not our department's data, but the UN and the private sector through Deloitte and what they were having. What I think it's fair to say is that in terms of investment decision, we have had domestic investment decisions held back as a result of some of the uncertainty around the Brexit process, but foreign direct investment into the UK, including from Europe, has been very strong because we've got strong economic fundamentals. They look at the United Kingdom, they see that our unemployment rate is half the Eurozone, they can see all the advantages we have in flexible workforce, our universities access to tech and so on, which makes it a good bet for the long term. And a lot of that investment, remember, is sovereign wealth funds or institutions, which was bolstered by the Norwegians last week, who said, again, they wanted more investment, not less in the UK.
I mean, anybody in your position would trot out those figures, wouldn't they? But getting a realistic assessment of the state of direct investment in this country means looking at how many companies have closed down and where I think we're losing things as well as where we're gaining. Why don't you do what other countries have done? And this is what Dr. Lewandowski highlighted to us. Other countries have done, like Ireland, like the United States, and look at the real situation on the ground rather than just trotting out the statistics that you want people to hear.
Because the statistics matter. Because, for example,
other way as well.
For example, the investments into the UK last year, which my department helped produce, produced and safeguarded well over 100,000 jobs. That matters.
Thank you. It doesn't matter. I'm saying that you should see other stuff.
If we're able to improve our database, we will.
Time, we have to move on from this point. Mark Western.
Secretary, final question. Good. Just on investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which, of course, you'll appreciate are pretty controversial and have been used in recent EU trade negotiations. What's your view on including ISDS in our future trade agreements, especially those countries that have very developed legal systems to which UK investors could have recourse?
So my view is that we have to ensure that our investors have proper protection. We have £1.3 trillion invested overseas. A lot of that will be things like our pension funds, for example. So we need to ensure that our investors are properly protected. We're in fact one of the world's top users of the investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms, although not a single case has been successful against the UK. But in outwards terms, I think it's very important that we give the protections. Now, I think it's more important that they get the protection than that we have a single mechanism applied. So when we're looking at agreements with countries where we've got similar or very similar agreements in our legal systems, perhaps the case is less strong for including a chapter there. But the key determinant of where we will be is, will our investors have the protection they need and the confidence to be able to do so? Because that external investment generates income back to the UK and in many cases protects areas like pensions.
Thanks. Just a final question. In your response to the report, you state that the CRAG Act provides a sound framework within